All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, you and I are going on a massive, grand-scale journey through the entirety of human history. The story of our civilization is essentially the breathtaking story of how humanity dragged itself out of absolute chaos and somehow figured out how to organize, survive, and build the complex world we live in today. Let's get right into it.
To help us digest thousands of years of history without getting lost, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the seeds of early civilization, move into the Age of Empires, shift over to faith, feudalism, and conquest, and finally wrap up with rebirth, discovery, and revolution.
First, let's just think about the sheer mind-boggling scale of time for a second. 3 billion years ago, we were literally just floating atoms. 6 million years ago, the very first hominids popped up. But human civilization itself, honestly, that didn't even start until a total blink of an eye ago, around 4000 BCE, when we finally decided, hey, let's stop wandering around and just settle down in Mesopotamia. Which brings us to Part 1, Seeds of Early Civilization.
Now, here's a pretty wild micro detail about what settling down actually did to our bodies. In early cities like Uruk, the invention of agriculture gave us this incredible food security, which was a total game changer. But the backbreaking, strenuous labor of farming, it literally caused early humans to physically shrink. We went from an athletic 5'9" on average down to a much smaller 5'3". So we basically traded our physical stature just for survival.
And well, when you suddenly have tens of thousands of people packed together in one place, you're gonna need some ground rules. Enter Hammurabi's Code in ancient Babylon. But listen, this was absolutely not about modern equality. Early civilizations actually introduced the whole concept of strict societal inequality just to maintain order. The law explicitly stated that a noble's bone was worth way more than a slave's. Crazy, right?
These harsh societal rules ended up building massive, towering structures of power. Just look at the base of the Egyptian hierarchy. You've got millions of peasants and slaves right at the bottom, and they're holding up layers and layers of artisans, scribes, and bureaucrats. And the entire purpose of this massive human machine, it was all to serve one single immortal goal. The pharaoh, sitting pretty at the very top, supposedly communicating directly with the gods.
Moving right along to Part 2, the Age of Empires.
Over in the East, the justification for absolute power took a really fascinating turn. During China's Zhou dynasty, they introduced something called the Mandate of Heaven. The idea was that heaven granted you the right to rule based entirely on your virtue and merit. But here's the kicker. If environmental disasters like floods or famines hit, people believed heaven was actually revoking its mandate. It was a literal sign to overthrow the leader. It introduced this incredible pendulum swing of power.
Meanwhile, in the West, ancient Athens was busy experimenting with this chaotic, loud version of democracy, where thousands of citizens would just vote all at once. And the Greek philosopher Plato? He vehemently rejected this. Actually, he thought it was a terrible idea. He argued that you shouldn't just have a randomly selected citizen steering the ship of state. Instead, he believed the world desperately needed a philosopher king, a leader dedicated purely to wisdom, logic, and absolute justice.
So how did these totally distinct mindsets play out in the real world? Well, they manifested in vastly different ways. Take Alexander the Great, a student of Aristotle. He built this completely unparalleled empire through aggressive, relentless, Western military glory. He was never defeated. But then by contrast, you have Ashoka the Great over in India. He initially expanded his empire through some incredibly bloody warfare, but was actually so horrified by the massive death toll that he completely flipped the script, fully embracing Buddhism and nonviolence.
This tension between republican ideals and absolute power reached a massive breaking point in the ancient world's greatest republic. See, Roman law strictly forbade a general from ever crossing the Rubicon River with an army. Doing so was flat-out treason, but in 49 BCE, Julius Caesar went ahead and took that single step anyway, actively choosing civil war over obeying the Senate. That one momentous choice marked the point of no return, instantly transforming Rome from a republic into an unstoppable empire.
Which brings us to Part 3, Faith, Feudalism, and Conquest.
Right around this time, the global landscape starts fracturing, and it happens fast. In 410 AD, the unthinkable actually happens. The Visigoths sack Rome, and that massive Western anchor just completely falls. Soon after that, in 630 AD, Muhammad takes Mecca, kicking off the unprecedented, rapid rise of Islam. And this sweeping reshaping of the religious map ultimately leads to some brutal, violent clashes of faith, which is perfectly exemplified when the First Crusade captures Jerusalem in 1099.
Now, do you remember that Egyptian hierarchy we looked at earlier? Well, medieval Europe adopted a very similar structure known as feudalism. Basically, it was used to organize a terrified, deeply fragmented society against things like Viking raids and general chaos. So you've got serfs tied directly to the land, protected by knights and nobles who are ruled by kings. But sitting at the very top of this new pyramid, holding the ultimate unquestionable authority of God, that was the Pope. But then, out of nowhere, a single leader emerges from the east and just completely disrupts this entire global order. Genghis Khan united 1 million Mongols and went on to build the largest contiguous empire in history. I mean, he used sheer terror and unparalleled brutality to conquer everything from Japan all the way to the Caspian Sea. Yet, and this is the wild part, he also outlawed enslaving his own people and permitted sweeping freedom of religion. A truly complex, mind-bending mix of progressive laws and absolute devastation.
Sometimes, though, it's actually nature that forces the biggest societal shifts. Think about the bubonic plague. With anywhere from 75 to 200 million people perishing, it was an absolutely unfathomable human tragedy. But because so many people died, Europe faced a massive labor shortage. Suddenly, the surviving peasant serfs realized they had leverage. They could actually demand better treatment and keep way more of their crops. So, this horrific tragedy, essentially and accidentally, birthed the earliest concepts of workers' rights.
And that leads us right into our final chapter, Part 4, Rebirth, Discovery, and Revolution.
As this new era dawned, the Renaissance-era elites were desperately scrambling to maintain their slipping control over the people. Niccolò Machiavelli famously wrote in his political manifesto that it is much safer to be feared than loved. It's a really chilling echo of those ancient power structures we saw with Hammurabi, explicitly stating that the masses are best controlled by the dread of punishment. Some things never change, right?
But honestly, all that elite control simply could not stop the birth of the modern world. In a rapid-fire succession of world-altering events, literally everything changes. In 1492, Columbus connects the Old and New Worlds. Then, in 1517, Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to a church door, which completely fractures the absolute monopoly of the Catholic Church. And by 1648, the Peace of Westphalia steps in to establish the modern concept of independent state sovereignty.
Okay, let's look at this final, magnificent pendulum swing. I mean, just look at how far we've come from Hammurabi's super strict caste system. You have the Magna Carta in 1215 demanding fair trials. You've got King Edward forming an early parliament. And then boom, in 1776, the American Declaration of Independence proudly claims that all men are created equal, right around the exact same time Adam Smith is publishing the foundations of free market economics. It is literally the incredible dawn of individual liberty.
We have journeyed all the way from hunched-over early farmers in Mesopotamia to god kings building giant pyramids, straight through philosopher emperors, feudal lords, and finally to the dawn of modern democracies and individual rights. It's been quite the ride. Which leaves us with this final provocative thought. As we continue to build our modern world today, what will be the very next great system to define humanity? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I will see you next time.